Right, we're going to have a look at the stories that are making international headlines this morning, aren't we? And we're starting with the Wall Street Journal today because it's leading with the US government shutdown, which could be a blessing in disguise, at least for some investors, as it presents buying opportunities.
Now, Gulf News says Asia-Pacific leaders have called for a fight against protectionism at the APEC summit as growth slows in parts of the region.
Now, here in the UK, a former government minister has disclosed to The Guardian that cabinet ministers and members of the National Security Council were in, quote, utter ignorance of the data gathering programs run by British and American intelligence agencies that were revealed, of course, by the American Edward Snowden.
US at odds with Europe over cloud computing. That's the headline in today's International Herald Tribune. It says the European Parliament is fiercely debating digital privacy as the impact from the snooping scandal continues.
The FT reports that the Chancellor, or Finance Minister, George Osborne, has sought clearance from the EU to split the Royal Bank of Scotland into a good and a bad bank.
The Independent runs with a storm gathers at the Winter Games as reports of widespread corruption and violations of workers' rights emerge ahead of next year's Winter Olympics in Russia.
And the Daily Mirror leads with Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban a year ago this week, being presented with a Pride of Britain Award by David Beckham.
Well, we're joined by Mark Davies, CEO of Strategy Consultancy at Camberton. Good morning, Mark. Good to see you.
Sally. Hi.
Right, let's start then with the Wall Street Journal and proof, perhaps, if it were needed, that every crisis does indeed present an opportunity.
You've taken the words out of my mouth. If there is a default, there's going to be plenty of opportunity to be buying at far lower levels than this, clearly. So I think this story is quite early to be running it. As we get closer and closer to the 17th of October, this will weigh on the markets, there's no question about it. And of course, that is an opportunity for some people. It does mean, though, that there are going to be an awful lot of people who are going to suffer. This is going to have a significant knock-on effect to the global economy were it to happen.
Some of the fund managers and various investors that they're quoting here talk about the fact that they're going to get in at this point and that point, invest huge amounts of money when stocks do fall. I think some of them, though, aren't wanting a default, are they? They're thinking prior, in the run-up, when we get to the 11th hour, when it looks like the deadlock isn't being organised, sorted out, these markets will be turbulent. They'll be up and down, won't they?
Of course they will. I mean, we've seen the fall overnight in Asia of 1%, and they're talking here about if it falls 2%, they want to buy in. Well, half of that's happened already. I think the issue is that they don't think it's going to go all the way to a complete default.
I think everybody's hoping and praying it doesn't.
And over the last 20 years, there have been 17 such situations in the US, and they haven't been talked about because they've all been resolved quite quickly. We are in a difficult position here because they are deadlock at the moment, and there doesn't seem to be too much sign that either side is going to give way.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously this is being portrayed as a very negative thing. This is a very bad thing. Half of the US government shut down. But actually, there are those who point out the positives, and that is that this is democracy really at work.
Well, this is American democracy at work. Obviously, this is not something that we really understand here in Britain because the system of government here is completely different. If you are the elected leader, i.e. the Prime Minister in this country, then you have the majority in Parliament, and the chances are you can push things through. In the United States, it doesn't work like that. The checks and balances that were put in place by their Constitution are completely different from the ones we have in this country.
Now, moving on to Gulf News in the business section, because these stories are related, of course, because President Obama, the rock star of APEC, we need to explain that acronym, I think. Sal, you can do that. He's not attending this very important meeting in Indonesia because he's staying home to deal with that domestic crisis. But Sal, you do tell us what APEC stands for, and then you can ban the acronym.
Well, it's the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, isn't it? And it's the various nations, 12-nation trade pact is under discussion. The Trans-Pacific program is discussed, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, all those that are there this article talks about various issues, but they say the policymakers who are there are looking to gain ground, increase their competitiveness in markets, and hopefully boost growth. And there's various thoughts out there as to who's growing more than others. And, Moody's is saying that the region's having a tough time. Delegates there are saying things are getting better. Give us your take on this meeting.
Well, yes, on the face of it, this article talks about the need not to go for protectionism in the current economic context. But actually, Martine's right. Really, what's important here is that President Obama is not present, and that the Chinese, as a result, are able to get in and make trade deals that perhaps President Obama would want to be leading from an American perspective, which he isn't able to do because he's back home trying to sort out a budget crisis.
Now let's have a look at The Guardian.
And why don't we link these two? Because I think
Yes,
they're
of
quite
course.
similar, aren't they? You've got The Guardian, Chris Huhne, former Cabinet Minister, disgraced Cabinet Minister, it must be said, he spent time in jail, revealing something that many members of government, of the Cabinet, didn't know about perhaps one of the most covert operations being carried out by the British government in cahoots with the US government. On the one hand, does that matter? And then you've got the International Herald Tribune, which is talking about digital privacy and cloud computing, which I'd like you to explain as well.
Yeah, and on the face of it, these are two stories about the same sort of thing. Of course, for a UK audience, there is an underlying story on the Huhne one, because you have this cabinet minister who's trying to rebuild his reputation, and he's been trying to do it through The Guardian. He's reverted to journalism, which was his former career, and he's making all sorts of comments. What for me is interesting with the Huhne one is that he was a member of the National Security Council rather than that he was a cabinet minister, because I wouldn't expect the cabinet to know every single part of what is going on. He was the Energy and Climate Change Secretary, so it wasn't the first thing on his agenda. As a member of the National Security Committee, in contrast, you might have expected him to know it. And it does open up the wider debate, and that is the one that's brought in by the International Herald Tribune about cloud computing. Cloud computing is when you store your data rather than on your computer somewhere up on the cloud, as they talk, but actually it's probably on some massive server in California. And the concern is that the Americans can get access to the servers in California in the way that they couldn't into your computer at home. Now, I think the reality is, if you're connected to the internet and they want to get access to your computer
It's
at home,
gonna happen,
they
isn't
can
it?
get access to your computer at home. So, I'm not sure that cloud computing is going to make a huge difference. I don't think that we're under any less threat, if we're under a threat, by virtue of the cloud than we are on our home machines.
Now, we're running out of time, so should we skip over the Financial
By all
Times?
means, by all
Can
means.
we? Osborne laying ground at EU for RBS split.
It'll be talked about in the days ahead.
All right, good bank and bad bank. All right, fine. But let's move on then to the Independent and that picture of Vladimir Putin raising the Olympic torch aloft, and as it starts its journey around, it's the longest journey ever of the Olympic torch, apparently.
Is that right? Well, it has got 11 time zones to cover if it goes across the whole of Russia, so I suppose that's hardly surprising. This is unsurprising that people who are unhappy about various things about Sochi, from gay rights activist issues to the way people have been treated in the building of the facilities, and human rights generally, are using the journey of the torch to make a stand. You would expect them to. If you remember back in London 2012, when the torch relay started, there were various people who had various things to say, and that's the moment to start saying it. So this is the Winter Olympic Games kicking off, and you'd expect people to have views and to bring them out.
Now, we must mention the Daily Mirror leading with Malala Yousafzai, who was shot by the Taliban a year ago this week, being presented with the Pride of Britain Award by David Beckham. But of course, it's a significant anniversary on many levels, and much of the press looking at this, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, this is a sweet story in that when she met David Beckham, she turned into the giggling schoolgirl that you would expect.
We'd all be like that, wouldn't we?
And was shocked by how tall he was relative to her. And it's very sweet the way they write it up. But obviously, yes, I mean, a year on. I think.
Thank you very much. Mark Davies, CEO of strategy consultancy Camberton, thank you. And thank you for being with us.
See you soon.